The conversations seek to ensure that civil society is kept up to date on the latest COVID-19 research, strengthen the culture of accountability between researchers and civil society, and contribute to shared learning and unlearning in the research sector as it relates to COVID-19. Today, we are joined by Ntando Yola. Ntando Yola is a founding member of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group and co-lead of APHA Advocacy for Prevention of HIV and AIDS, a 2013 AVAC fellow with a track record in advocacy for stakeholder engagement in the HIV prevention trials. He was a keynote speaker at the 2013 AIDS Vaccine Conference, at which he contributed to setting the standard for civil society engagement in vaccine and HIV prevention research processes. He has invested over a decade working with the Desmond Tutu HIV Center and is well known in the South African vaccine development and advocacy community. Colleagues, his community engagement work has included working in trials across various research networks as a member of the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, HVTN, Social Behavioral Working Group, and the current Community Working Group co-chair of the HIV Prevention Trials Network, HPTN. Ntando is committed to facilitating the work of the VAG to support civil society groups and other role players in South Africa through the dissemination of appropriate messaging and mobilization of all role players for HIV vaccine research and development. He's also a member of the South African Health Technologies Advocacy Coalition, SATAC Health Research Advocacy Group, with a specific focus on HIV prevention research and related infections, as well as being the chairperson of the SANAC Men's Sector. Ntando is a steering committee member of Africa Free of New HIV Infections, AFNI, a regional HIV prevention research community and advocacy platform. Colleagues, as usual, the calls are structured so that we hear an overview of the guests' work in the first half of the call, followed by an open floor for the remaining time we have left. Please share questions, comments, and thoughts in the chat box, and we'll try to get as many of them as possible answered. Those we might not be able to get to will be captured and the guest will respond to them in writing, and these will form part of the post-call summary, which you'll be able to access from the African Alliance's website, which we'll be relaunching this month. So Ntando Yola, thank you for making the time to engage with us. Welcome again, and over to you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, Tian, and welcome to everybody to these conversations that have really provided a platform for us as civil society to engage in processes that relate to research, and particularly vaccine research. And I think as part of this conversation today, I'm just going to briefly talk about the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, which is also known as the VAC, and just to touch a bit on some of the work that we do, and also just, I think, leave quite a bit of time for us to have, very important conversations or any conversations or questions, I think, as Tian has highlighted. So as you can see that the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group is really a group of advocates, which I'm going to be sharing as well, who really gathered and were very driven by a need to have a platform where a group of advocates really come together, and a platform where we really get to engage with communities. And here are some of the things that we're really about to build a cadre of advocates who are equipped to meaningfully engage and influence the research agenda and processes. And we are really a group that recognizes the important role that is played by vaccines and other biomedical approaches on a number of health issues that, as the world and as communities, do confront us from time to time. In fact, one of the main areas that we really started working on are HIV vaccines and other research actually that relates to HIV, prevention. Other vaccine development processes that we've come to be involved in, as we all know, especially at the beginning of this year, is COVID-19 vaccine research, as well as other research, as well as other TB vaccine research, and I think we are a group that is very open to broadly the public health engagement and impact, especially when it comes to research. And one of the things that is very key to this engagement is to ensure that we promote national and global guidelines that guide the work of research and how stakeholders and communities ought to be engaged in research processes. And I think this is something that is very much important. And in fact, we will see and learn, we can talk openly about some of the guidelines that we have, as we do have the guidelines in South Africa. But I think our other partners who are placed in other parts of the world have their national guidelines. But I think as the global world that comes together to really deal with all of the health issues that we are facing, as I have mentioned, we do rely on a range of global guidelines that really provide a guidance in terms of what are the important principles and practices that really should be adhered to and should really be held high as part of the research processes. And in fact, all of these guidelines, one thing that is common amongst them is the aspect of ensuring that research is anchored in ethical conduct and in ways that really recognize the human rights as part of the research. And I think this is really based on a history that we know of in terms of how research has happened in the past, in different parts of the world, where a lot of the powerful would really just conduct research for the purposes of answering questions, but had the gross disregard of human rights as well as ethics as we know them today. And in fact, with regards to that, we also, as the VAC, have really produced a few reports that really highlight some perceptions and some experiences of different communities with regards to different research that that we really have been involved in. So as part of all of that, we are very much highlighting the important aspect of ensuring that science cannot, with all the resources and with all the expertise that science and scientists and research organizations, including funding organizations, have, cannot do it alone. It is very, very much important, and especially according to a lot of global agreements, to really make sure that communities who are the sole beneficiaries at the end for all the interventions that are being researched, they are involved as early as possible. They're involved, in fact, even during the research. And I think there are a lot of descriptions and definitions that highlight what that kind of involvement should be. But I think most importantly, the communities who are who have interest in the research, from time to time, part of our work is to make sure that their voices are heard and they really inform all the processes of research. And the reason, really, amongst many reasons, why we promote this kind of involvement is to ensure that, when all the research processes lead to a number of discoveries, because we have experienced with regards to research, especially in HIV, where research does work and it does it successfully, and comes a time when the outcomes of research have got to be taken into public health, and there are a lot of delays, there are a lot of obstacles, and some of the obstacles, there is evidence that shows it is as a result of the fact that advocacy groups and activist organizations and entities who have an interest in eliminating some of the diseases have not been involved as early enough in the research processes. So when we come to a point where policies have got to be developed, we have to start afresh to try and really bring people up to speed about basic concepts, and a lot of concepts that are questionable around how research came about and how we got to a point where we have an intervention that has been tested and proved to be effective to really help in the prevention of certain diseases and pathogens. And I think through all of that processes, we then promote accountability between the research field in its broad sense. When we talk about the research field in the broad sense, we're talking about the funding organizations, the research organizations in country, and ethics bodies, regulatory bodies, and governments who make sure that there are policies and guidelines in place, and really we build that bridge that ensure that there is continuous engagement, which results in accountability. But I think most importantly, it is really about making sure that all the work that we do results in the impact for which it was meant to do. So that's really briefly about who we are as the Vaccine Advocacy, Advocacy Resource Group. Amongst those, we have very strategic objectives, which are really at the center of the work that we do as the VAG. And here are the main three ones: is to ensure that we build the capacity of stakeholders who are involved in HIV vaccine research. And as I have mentioned in other research, and that is part of what we're really working on with regards to COVID research. We really ensure that there is a strengthened accountability, which I really spent a lot of time talking about, of the HIV vaccine trial sector. And we can share as time goes by on some of the work that really has gone into ensuring that there's this high level of accountability. We also are there to strengthen and sustain the global and national HIV vaccine advocacy mainstreamed in the HIV prevention agenda. Now, we really speak about HIV at this point because this is really where our work started. However, we get to be involved in a whole lot of other vaccine research work. Here are the advocates who are really strategically placed in different parts of the world, and I will leave it to you all to at least look and have an exercise of establishing the flags, and then you can tell where all of them are placed in the world. And these are all the advocates who are part of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group from the various regions of the world. We are hosted as a secretariat, if you like, by African Alliance, and these are the partners that we have worked with, and mostly, as we have mentioned, with partners who are, some are collaborators and some are really supporting the work that we do in different ways. And I think I will really not go into them, but I think I would like to mention some of the organizations that are leading the research that we have mostly been involved in. The HIV Vaccine Trials Network, which actually has another network that is involved in COVID research, as well as in partnership with the HIV Prevention Trials Network. We also have the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, and you can also look up some of these organizations, and the South African Medical Research Council, which has also, as part of the entities that are part of the South African government. We work closely with them, in terms of really achieving some of the work that we are doing. We have these researchers who really play a very critical role in being a resource. We call them the emissaries, who play a role of enriching and refining, and in fact provide guidance in the advocacy work that we are doing. And as you can see, 3 of them are really based in South Africa. And then we have Dr. Kundai Chinyenze, who is with IAVI, based in Nairobi, and Professor Qureshi Abdul Karim, who is based in South Africa at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as Caprisa, and Professor Linda Gale Becker, who is with the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, and as well as Prof. Professor Glenda Gray, who is with the South African Medical Research Council, as well as the lead of an organization that does research in Johannesburg and Soweto, which is known as PHRU. And she is also a lead at the, within the HIV vaccine trials network. So they really provide a key guidance. But I think besides this, and in addition to this, we really work with a lot of research leaders globally as well as in the country, and linked specifically as well to the partners, you know, the members, the VAC members who are placed in different parts of the world. So I think I will really leave it there, and here are some of the partners that we're working with for the purposes of the COVID conversations. And the rest, really, I will leave it to us to really talk and engage more around on any of the issues that you have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ntando. I think that was really informative. Colleagues, a reminder, please share questions, thoughts, comments in the chat box, and we'll get to them. Ntando, I want to get through some of the pre-submitted questions. I think one issue that has characterized the work, not only of the VAG, but even APHA, that you're a co-founder of, has really been the broader contextual issues in the country. And I think one of those issues is that of patriarchy. Now, as you spoke and shared some of your experiences and thoughts, we know that currently you have a role at the helm of the SANAC men's sector. And it's really triggered some thought processes in terms of saying that this surely has to be one of the sectors within civil society that faces the biggest challenge, because patriarchy permeates every single aspect of our lives, how we live, how we work, how we love, how we stay healthy. And certainly we've seen how this impacts trial participation, awareness of research. What, in your view, does a structure, for example, like the men's sector, have the potential of bringing to the table in terms of advancing research that is gender transformative, that takes into cognizance these broader contextual issues? Over the last, certainly nearly 2 decades we've been doing this work, we've constantly seen issues of poverty, of inequality, of violence being brought into the research space by sheer necessity, because it forms such a huge part of South Africans' lives. Do you think that the men's sector has a role to play in terms of how we can do research better in terms of this particular context in South Africa?
Thank you, Tia. And I think that's a very important question. And I think it is something that is really at the center of the work that we are really doing. And I think I will say it on the onset that actually, you know, patriarchy is really an issue that we are facing as the country specifically, for the reasons that you really are highlighting. And in fact, for a number of reasons that are even mentioned in the strategic objectives of the National Strategic Plan in South Africa, which really are as a result of a lot of issues or a lot of activities or things that are done primarily by men in South Africa that really drive a whole lot of, you know, social ills. To come to your question, I think the men's sector in its goals and strategic objectives is to really deal with all of these issues by building a movement of men who are very conscious about all of the issues that particularly women and children play as a result of our actions as men, and to really work in a very intentional way where, you know, men are really mobilized so that we provide spaces where we confront all of these issues and have engagements amongst men, you know, to really have what we would call honest conversations. And in fact, if they become honest, you know, it is one issue that we can talk a lot more about. But I think one of the things that are very critical and are very important is the fact that out of a certain group of men who are not perfect by any means, we are really able to find mechanisms of bringing all of these issues and see what role we can play. And within that willingness and building that consciousness, there is certainly a role that we can play. But it is a role that is huge and very complex and humongous. And you know, if we are doing well in really in contributing to all the questions that you have raised, I think it remains to be seen for a whole number of reasons. But I think one of the things that really encourages me as part of the men's sector is having, be it it's one or two or three, of which at this point it is more than that, men who really are recognizing this. But I think as we go into the conversation, we'll get to realize how complex this is and how, you know, how long or how historical the issues that we are facing as a result of the things that we were confronted with as men. And then it really becomes a very difficult thing to work around. But I think most importantly, there must be a start somewhere, and the men's sector is really, you know, doing a lot to try and address those.
Thank you. So a question from our colleague at TB Proof, Ingrid Skuman. She's asking, I was wondering how communication material is developed for trials. So that's the first part of the question, is how do we develop communication materials for trials? And then a second question is, how then is affected community involvement happening?
Well, so here, one of the things that really happens in terms of the development of materials for trials is that, you know, the organizations that are doing a lot of the research work, and some of them I have mentioned here, they take on that responsibility of working with the communities who are directly participating in research. And I think as part of that, in terms of, you know, all the resources and budgets that they have, which I think is very important, is having mechanisms of consulting with communities about the purposes of why the materials are developed and the purposes of, you know, and the messaging that is really important for ensuring that, you know, the materials that are developed are speaking to the communities who are going to be taking part in these trials. So there are really a lot of mechanisms that we can consider, but I think the broader stakeholder engagement frameworks that, you know, some of us are working in really speak to these materials, you know, that inform how all of the messaging is developed. But I think one of the things that is important in this age, especially during this COVID era, is that, you know, one questions if the materials as we know them in terms of the print material that gets to be given to communities is really effective in sending out messages. And I do think that at this point, everybody is on social media, and this really is a platform that we should be using as much in terms of the material that we really want to develop and spread the messaging. But in terms of how, it is really important that, you know, we hear from the people who are interested in this work, who understand communities, instead of having, you know, those who want to do research that just thinking and deciding what kind of material is needed for, you know, for all the messages and a lot of myths and misconceptions that we want to address with regards to research. I think that was the first part of the question. I don't know, I can't remember the second part here.
So the second part was, and I'm not sure if that's the link to a separate question, but how does involvement happen with affected communities? Could you characterize and speak to how, in your experience, involvement does or perhaps should happen when it comes to dealing with communities impacted by any issue in general?
Well, involvement is, and I think it's important to really recognize the principles that I've spoken about with regards to why there should be involvement. And I think if we really understand it very well, of which a lot of us as community engagement practitioners and advocates, we find that there is variation, especially by, some researchers on how they really understand these principles. Some, they see it as a burden that impedes the progress in terms of the research that they are doing. And I think those are the things that need to really be addressed, because I think once there is that willingness and there is that buy-in, which is the same buy-in that we actually need from communities, and these are the things that a lot of these guiding documents, which are mostly informed by advocates and other community representatives, they do provide a way of really bringing on board the voices of those who are affected by the research or any of the work that we want to do. And I think, without really answering the question in terms of the specifics of the question, but I think one of the most important things in my view is that engagement really requires researchers and the research field that recognizes the importance of why there should be engagement. And I think everything else after that, once the stance changes, really is able to flow. And we can figure out, we can talk about a whole range of approaches of engagement. But I think for me, what is important is that recognition by those who are in power with regards to research.
Thanks. And I think certainly as this group, we've had that very real experience in the last few months in terms of moments where we've been taken aback at how involvement or engagement is happening. And you kind of wonder why we're at this place in 2020 in terms of how communities are being engaged or taking part in research. So Yvette, who is also your co-founder with APHA, that's been a great partner over these COVID Conversation weekly calls, is asking, could you speak a bit more to what men can do to support women in research as peers? And she's speaking here around the lived experience around male engagement really coming across as male permission. So what do you think men should be doing to support women in the research space? If that has happened, could you maybe share an example? And if it hasn't happened, what do you think are the most immediate low-hanging fruits that men could take advantage of to support women in the research space?
I think so. This is a very important question. In fact, it is something that I have experienced the research field having to really deal with, especially with regards to all the structural issues that we're dealing with of violence, especially against women, which lead to high rates of really unwanted situations, be it psychologically or in terms of health, and of course in the context of HIV and TB and especially COVID, which is one of the things that we've really gotten reports around. And I also want to be very clear that whilst I'm probably being asked this question because I am part of the men's sector, which is just an entity. I think one of the things that we probably as a collective of advocates have to recognize is that when we talk of men, or in fact, when we talk of any population group in the context of the work that we are doing, we can tend to speak as if we're speaking for a whole multitude of men. and I think that is not humanly possible. But I think to come to the question, I think one of the things that are constantly debated around the issue that Yvette is raising is the fact that some of the prevention or modalities that have been researched have been framed as products where, you know, women can take them without the consent of men. And part of the debate around that framing is a debate that wants to not recognize the fact that, you know, men and women, and especially in heterosexual relationships, are part of the work, and it is based on the same things that we're talking about. It is inevitable that, you know, there is this level of influence that is happening, at least in those close relationships that are happening within homes and communities. And again, there is the same issue of patriarchy that really affects how all of this work. How can they be engaged? I think it's very important to then, for those men and or even women who have access to the men that we know are problematic, to really find ways of engaging with those groups of men, and in fact bring on board a whole lot of other organizations that are directly working and dealing with the issues that pertain to these problematic issues of patriarchy and masculinity that we characterize as very toxic in relationships. So there are many approaches that can be used to really engage around, you know, these issues, and in fact, they should not, in my view, be framed specifically for research, because the issues, you know, research is just one component where masculinity and patriarchy expresses itself. But I think for most of us, we know that these issues are issues that are in society. And I think it is then within that understanding and context important that all the efforts should not specifically be targeted or isolated to work around research and, you know, and other very specific issues that we are working with. A million-dollar question is if we can be really able to be united as different communities and as different genders to really address these issues as collectives. And I think that's a question that remains to be answered.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that is becoming really clear from this particular engagement is how, and I think we saw this on last week's engagement as well with Mabelani and the Community Constituency COVID-19 Front, is that by virtue of the positions we hold in the sector, it's usually very difficult to hone in just on research without issues of gender, of transformation, of white supremacy, of racism, of silencing of communities' voices come into it. So it's a very complicated space, but thank you for your insights. So I think one of the difficult questions that we would need to ask in this space, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is, having said what you've said, having worked over a decade in the space, having experienced what you've experienced now during COVID and since the advent of COVID, where do you think civil society has dropped the ball? Have there been moments where you stepped back and thought, gosh, you know, that was a strategic moment that passed, or that was a really great opportunity we could have, perhaps should have taken advantage of? And so I just want your reflections on where you think as a collective are the specific areas we could do better. in terms of advancing the field in general, whether it's community ownership, whether it's dealing with white supremacy or racism in the space, or representation in the space?
I think some of the things that I have really observed in terms of the broader civil society space, and I would in this instance be speaking from a perspective of a lot of HIV, TB, and STI work, which is a specific sector of civil society. And I think speaking of a specific sector actually touches on the very issue of how we are pockets and pockets and pockets of the work, that we are working in. And I think that is one of the areas where we really are missing the power that we could have as civil society, as a collective, in the sense that we are very much divided, even within the very sector of HIV and TB. Again, we get, which is something that is not intended, but we really are about, I'm about a specific issue. I'm about prevention. I'm about treatment, and you can name them on and on. I think we really do not have a very good strategy of recognizing that, from being those different pockets that contribute to the work, there is power in coming together and really finding ways of bringing the different expertise and areas of interest that we have in terms of the different work that we're doing. And because I think that would then give us very strong power to be able to change a lot of things that we really would like to address, especially in the context of South Africa, where we are really dealing, and I think a lot of the disease areas that we are addressing are affecting, communities who are disadvantaged because of their social standing and economic standing in society. So we somehow, it looks like we believe we can win all of these issues by just doing them all alone. That, we are this group who can do this alone, and we are this group who can do this alone. And I think that's one of what I really see as as lost opportunities as civil society. But if there is something that can be done about that, I do not know, because I think, when we talk, even if we can make reference to political movements, one of the things that we realize, that is argued, is that the way activism movements that are looking for a specific change develop and progress, it happens in this manner where, people are divided, people are not able to really work towards having the same vision, and because I think all of us, in our differences, we all want the same things. But if how we then come together to really address all of these issues, and it is even happening with regards to research. We really are not having a way, and I would really love to get, people who have an idea, who have really cracked an idea that can really bring us together in order to be united in how we fight the issues that we face as society, and especially as Black people, from the socioeconomic issues that we face to these social issues of violence and patriarchy, as we have mentioned, and to dealing with issues of poverty and many, many other issues. So it is very difficult, but I believe one area that we have lost is how we get divided, and how, in fact, the resources are at the center of determining, how we view the work that we do and what it is that we are willing to advocate for, and disregard other aspects of, of the work that we want to advocate for.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that's really interesting perspective. And I mean, I think in my ideal world, I'd love for us to get to a place where we see the prominence of the scientific budgeting almost perhaps not at par, but certainly more visible than it is now. I think if you look at many trials and organizations, line items, it's always interesting for me to look and see the community engagement line item. It almost pales in ridiculous comparison to all of the other costs. And so I think that until we get some of that prominence or visibility in the budgets, I think our work will never be done. I mean, I think you've spoken about the work of the VAG. You've touched on your role as well earlier in the call around APHA. But apart from that, you also mentioned your involvement in a lot of these really large, very powerful networks, including, for example, the HVTN and the HPTN. Now, these networks are multi-million-dollar funded. They wield huge power globally. And depending on who you are and where you're standing, their community involvement and engagement takes different shapes and forms. How have you navigated the space as an advocate and reconciled that with your role in these networks, which from an outsider's point of view might seem very regulated and very stringent? How have you been able to carry your voice and carry the volume of your voice from the advocacy space into those spaces, which to an outsider will seem very regulated and tightly managed? I think you're on mute.
So no, thanks, Dan. I really don't know how I have done that, but I think yeah, I mean, I'm keeping quiet because I think it's a very, very difficult thing to do, to really navigate working with, in spaces that have got so many layers that are infused with a lot of power, and whatever you'd really you can characterize it. But I think there's a lot of power dynamics, and that really makes it difficult, because you then become at some point within those layers or the hierarchies that exist within the work that we're doing. But I think, having said that, it is really important to acknowledge that at the end of it all, a lot of people, and this is something that I have come to acknowledge as part of the work that I am doing, that a lot of these powerful people who are working in this space, they are informed by an interest to really make a contribution. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I think that's one of the things that, as I pushed myself to get closer into these spaces and take my very, weak voice to stand up and continue to strengthen it, as you continue to say the things in spaces that are very intimidating, spaces, that can unintentionally be somewhat violent to communities, without intention, and which I think my resolve has been to really try and not say and get there to say the things that are hardly spoken about. I really do not have a formula, but I think having a community of advocates, of which some are here, people that I work with, that we work with, and I think that sense of community helps us to be able to draw from each other's strength, so that, we bring support, moral support, psychological support, and, resources support, actually, and a lot of strategies. I mean, if I can make an example, about people who are here, that there is a lot of stuff that I gain from you as Tian. There's a lot of stuff I gain from being part of the community with Yvette. For instance, Miranda. And I think that sense of community is what helps us, to recognize each other's strength. And when there are spaces where I cannot openly say certain things, I know that, Tian will stand up to really highlight those things, same as Yvette and many others, who are part of this. So I think knowing that I have a community of advocates and communities actually that I work with behind me is really what keeps me going and what gives me strength to really be vocal about these issues. But not only be vocal, because I think, as we know, once you become vocal, you then get to be offered to be, in decision-making spaces, because maybe you are making noise, which again, the more you get into those spaces, it gets very, very difficult, to continue and, and engage. But I think the most important thing that I value is being a member of all of the tribe, if you like, that really gives you strength, or give me strength, to know that whatever I say, I am saying on behalf of the collective. In fact, the collective that has given me the right to speak on their behalf, because I think that's one of the issues that we're dealing with, where, a lot of people nominate themselves to speak on behalf of the rest of the people, which I think becomes, again, very tricky, because it's really stuff that's just about me as an individual, but it's not about the issues that I really get. So I do need to be very close to the communities, in all of the layers that they exist in.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Ntando. I mean, I think as you were speaking, that phrase kept on coming to my mind, that, there's times where we need to stand up and speak even when our voice shakes. And I know certainly there's times where, I would be in the same room with you and certainly agree that it's about playing off each other's energies and seeing the most strategic opportunity to speak. And it's a difficult space to be in, and it's something that I think we don't really usually have the space to be vulnerable in the space, because I think many people on the call might agree with me that civil society also is a quite complicated, at times toxic, at times violent space. And so it's about navigating our common goal, I think, which you articulated so perfectly. So thank you for that. I can see we're 10 minutes to the top of the hour. I wanted to just ask you to reflect on, having said what you said, both as a member of the VAG and as the co-founder of APHA, what do you think advocates going forward, perhaps in the next 3 months, towards the end of the year, should really have top of their mind in terms of where are the strategic low-hanging fruits that we should be putting our energy, our under-resourced energy, I should say, our non-financed passion, where should we be focusing on as we lead up to the end of the year, as advocates who have a collective vested interest in ensuring that research in general, but specifically COVID-19 research, continues to be held to account?
I think, I love it when you keep saying there are low-hanging fruits, which are very hard to see. But I think, many things are coming to my mind, but I think at this point, one of the very important issues that we are dealing with is all of the COVID research that we are in all our different parts are involved in, and have voices in really making sure that the community's interest and voices as part of this research are very critical, because we saw ourselves going back somehow to an age that we really didn't want to see, where communities' voices were very much disregarded. And to an extent, whilst it could be justifiable early at the beginning that, this is an emergency situation and so we do not have a lot of time. But I think 2, 3, 6 months time down the line, that really wasn't really a justifiable excuse to not engage stakeholders. But I think part of the difficulty is that this is not well understood. The whole COVID situation is not well understood. But the main challenge that we're really facing is, which I think we should really unite and really engage with the process about the development of all of the in modalities to prevent or treat COVID is an issue of accessibility. Because I think there's a lot of talk about how well will we be able to access the successful products that are being tested, and of which some of these products are being tested in our part, especially in South Africa. The question of access to these products is the main issue that really needs us to be very focused, to be united again, and really come together and use this platform and these spaces to really engage with those processes, because they are at a political level. Countries that are rich are going to be able to access, the vaccines that are being developed. I mean, the US is clear. They're saying it time and time again that by December, we are looking to have one vaccine candidate. This then means that the US is going to have preference, in terms of access. But what does then that mean about, a country like ours, which is the most impacted country by COVID in Africa? And in fact, a lot of research which has seen a lot of the uproar around, negativity around research, which we have been vocal as advocates that actually there is a need to do vaccines because vaccines work. We really stood up to do that. But there's this layer that we probably have not caught up early enough to engage with, in terms of ensuring that when the US tomorrow celebrates that we have a vaccine, and South Africa and the US is bulk buying, vaccines for their population because it is at this political stage in the US, what are we doing as advocates to really make sure that we make our voices very strong, so that we actually show that, these vaccines work, and in fact, we need them more than any other. And in fact, the reason that we worked to mobilize and send positive messages around vaccine research in the midst of anti-vaccine movements that are really rising. What is it that we should be doing to make sure that, our government is preparing to get all of this, because we do not know. So there's a focus that is focused in the processes of research, but we have to engage with policymakers in making sure that, we are prepared to really buy these, and that so that they benefit our communities.
Thanks for that, Ntando. We have 5 minutes left. So in 3 minutes, what is next for Ntando in his various roles of the VAG, APHA, and the range of spaces and platforms that you enjoy access to and presence on? What is next for you as an activist in this space?
I think it's, for me, one of the most important things and things that I personally pray for is initially when we spoke about breaking the bridges or the barriers between research and communities. And in fact, I think we have some small wins with regards to that, but I think there are a lot of bridges with regards to, there are a lot of barriers, with regard between communities, where, communities are really focused in different aspects that is about their interest, which I think is understandable. And one of the things that I've really worked on a lot in my life is that I have happened to be in the research field, but also happened to be part of advocates. And just by me saying that raises a question that isn't this the same group actually that should be working together? And I think one of the things that I'm very much interested in is to bring those parts together so that we can really recognize and acknowledge the spaces and the opportunities that can bring us together, because in that aspects of togetherness, that's where lies in our power to be able to change and have the things that we want to see happen.
Great, thank you for that. So colleagues, as we reach the top of the hour, I've put some social media handles in the chat. As you've heard, Ntando is a co-founder of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group. You can follow the VAG on the handle there, as well as APHA SA. Ntando and Yvette Raphael are the co-founders, along with Brian Kanyemba, of a group called APHA. And so I think it is just left for me to say thank you very much, Ntando, for your time. It's always great to have these interactions. And I think as we go ahead and we hold each other accountable and we find ways to navigate this constantly difficult, but always interesting and learning-filled space, we can do so a lot better if we have each other's back. So thank you, colleagues. Please join us next week, Thursday, at the same time, where we'll bring you yet another webinar that aims to bridge the gaps between scientific research, COVID-19, and the advocacy space. Thank you, colleagues. Have a great Thursday further, and thank you again, Ntando.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.